Alright, today we got a longer video on Mrcasey World War II. I'll take you from start to finish. We'll hit some different theaters and let's get going. So first, 3 theaters of war. You should know: the European, the Pacific, and of course the Desert Theater, or what we call the North African Theater. These 3 theaters is where everything's going down, and it's a nice way to organize everything together. So to start, we talk about Adolf Hitler and his rise, his ability to speak. And one of the things I want you to remember is that Adolf Hitler was given power. The Reichstag burned down, and it's a very controversial moment in history. Adolf Hitler essentially tells the people, listen, the communists did it. The communists burnt down your Reichstag, or your Capitol building, and as a result, I need power. You need to give me power, me and my SA troops, my brown shirts, so that I can keep you protected from the communists that are coming in. He essentially created a threat and then proposed that he'd be the solution, and the people went along with it. They gave him power. He did not need to take power. And at the beginning of the unit, I always do a big story regarding Adolf Hitler and some of the things that he went through: losing his father, his mother, failing his art exams, being homeless for 4 years, reading the anti-Semitic literature inside of Austria, serving in the Great War as a runner, literally crying like a baby because the Germans lost, and meeting that National Socialismus Party in the beer hall in Munich, essentially taking the Treaty of Versailles, breaking it down piece by piece, trying to take over the government with the beer hall putsch. He was ended up being thrown away into jail for 9 months. He wrote a book, made 4 predictions, and then you have them down below. This is the world that he has created, and this is his story. So make sure that you know it really, really well. Now, to do today's lesson, we're going to need to be able to go through and, I guess, see the map of Europe, see where everything is, and be able to go through it step by step. Because Adolf Hitler does do his conquering, what he will call Lebensraum, step by step. Before I get into it, let's know the size of the war. Germany, Italy, and Japan. Italy being a fascist country, Germany being a socialist fascist country, Japan being highly militaristic. And then you've got France, Great Britain, in the U.S., which are, democracy, capitalism side countries, although today they're more socialist, right, with France and Britain. And then the USSR, which is highly communist, led by Joseph Stalin himself. And there's reasons why it says after June 1941. That's after Stalingrad, and after Operation Barbarossa. And of course, the U.S. after December 7th, 1941. That's of course Pearl Harbor. So let's talk about causes of World War II. We've talked about it at length. The Treaty of Versailles is probably your number one. If there's one treaty you want to know, it's the Treaty of Versailles for this global test. Another one would of course be the Treaty of Nanking. Italy and fascism. The Italians are going to take over Ethiopia. That is like, I sort of akin that to going into the bus and beating up a 4th grader. Like, the rest of the world's like, what are you doing over there, Italy? And Italy is essentially saying, no, we're back to Roman glory. I don't think it's like that. Japan's going to begin conquering. Remember, we talked about why they were turning to imperialism with Commodore Matthew Perry, Meiji Restoration, Isen Goran, and Nanking. But just be able to have that story in your brain. It's led by Emperor Hirohito, and maybe to more of an extent, there's a military commander, Hideki Tojo, a general within the army that you should really know. And it sort of makes sense when we talk about Japanese feudalism. The emperor was kind of like a figurehead. In many ways that remained true even in this World War II era Japan. The League of Nations follows a policy of appeasement. One person that you want to associate with appeasement, giving in to demands to avoid war, would be Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain. Please know that name. So, here's our map, and this is the situation that we've got going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be drawing on this map, changing it up, and show you Adolf Hitler's counterclockwise aggression. So here I go. This map sort of simplifies things. It talks about Germany, right? Germany's really not Germany. If we're being honest with ourselves, it's the Weimar Republic, and it's under heavy inflation. When Adolf Hitler is given power, right, burning the Reichstag, blaming the communists, what he does is he begins to use the Treaty of Versailles as sort of a checklist. And so he's going to go piece by piece. And the first place that he's going to take over is this place in here. It's an area known as the Rhineland, which borders the Rhine River. And he says, there's a lot of German-speaking people here, so we're taking this over. He's using his new army. He's sort of testing the boundaries. And he takes it over, and the rest of the nations of the world say, okay, Adolf, listen, you can't take over any more land. That's it. I know it's historically been yours, so we're going to give that to you, but please, please, no more land after that. And Adolf says, of course, you can trust me, right? And he begins building up his power more and more and more. So the next place that he's going to take over, as he sort of pushes through, is he's going to push through this place called Austria, where he was homeless for 4 years. And you can sort of imagine what that must have been like. He calls it the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. And again, the League of Nations says, please don't do this, Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler does it anyway, and they say, okay, no more after this. I know there's a lot of German-speaking people in Austria, but again, no more. And Adolf promises, and he tells them, Scouts honor, such and such. Well, he continues his trek, thinking like a clock. He's going to move in a, counterclockwise direction, right? This is his direction. He's not trying to fool you. He hits Czechoslovakia. And when he hits Czechoslovakia, the League of Nations sits down and say, okay, we need to meet. And Adolf Hitler's like, yeah, I know a spot, this beer hall where I met 6 men and became, a talented speaker in the National Socialist Party. I'm talking about this place called Munich, which is, somewhere about here, maybe, if we're thinking about it, somewhere about here. And at Munich, they discuss. They come to terms. Neville Chamberlain's a part of this thing to a lesser extent. Over in Great Britain would be Winston Churchill, screaming and yelling at Adolf Hitler, saying you can't trust this guy, and how right he was, right? And essentially what they come to terms with is a couple of things. Number one, they're going to give him the rest of Czechoslovakia. The whole thing. They're going to give him all of that land, right? They're going to give him the whole thing. In addition, they say, this is it. That's all the land that you get. You're going to get Czechoslovakia. We're going to leave you alone. He had only taken over an area near Germany, what he called the Sudetenland. He had only taken over a little piece of it. So he had, this little swath of territory. I'm going to highlight it for you, if I can get my computer to work a little better. And this little area here, he already had troops in these borders. And essentially he's telling the people, I'm going to take all of this land, and they just watched him. And Neville Chamberlain goes back on plane, and he's like, this is great. We stopped Adolf Hitler. There's no war. And he's like celebrating. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler takes over the rest of Czechoslovakia. He famously calls over the League of Nations and all of their leaders worms, and basically says, I'm going to crush them. So the Munich Conference is known for appeasement. Please know that. Now, is Adolf Hitler done? Well, if you've been listening to me at all, of course not. And he's not going to try to change it up. He's going to go the same way, right? He continues that path, and he's going to go into Poland. And he uses a famous strategy called the Blitzkrieg. You hit the opponent with bombs using your Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and you hammer, 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 hammer. And then behind it are your tanks, and the tanks are rolling really fast. Germany had these tanks called Panzer tanks, and they're very, very fast. And Poland, their geography, it was very flat. So the tanks, mixed with this flat geography, they were able to roll right over Poland. And here's the situation. When he rolls over Poland, the Polish fight back with horses. Well, you can imagine, horse versus tank, it's not going to go over well. Well, I always tell my students, evil recognizes evil. As the Polish start to fall, guess who looks out and says, that's bad news, this is a bad dude, and I would know it because I'm a bad guy myself. I'm talking about, of course, Joseph Stalin. And so Joseph Stalin comes and pushes in his troops, coming from the east. And so he's got his soldiers. And what they agree to do is they agree to split Poland. Split Poland. And so, Poland is split in half, and from Joseph Stalin's perspective, he thinks that this is going to be able to insulate him, to protect him from the Nazi Germans. And so he does. He's going to sign the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and the Nazi-Soviet pact splits Poland in half. I always tell my students that it's like two guys with knives behind their back. You're just waiting for the one to stab the other, and we'll talk about who stabs who first. But the Nazi-Soviet pact is signed. Now, meanwhile, what the Allies do is they start to get ready. You know, after this, war is here, and the French, and to a lesser extent the British, are going to start mobilizing their forces along this little green line here. They're going to create the Maginot Line, which is this series of concrete bunkers that they had been building up throughout the 20s, and they are ready to go. Like, they are on this line, they are prepared, thinking that Germany's going to come right through that shared border. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler's like, no, I'm not trying to fool you. I'm just going to keep going my direction, right? So he has moved through the Rhineland. He's moved through Austria. He's moved through Czechoslovakia. He's now hit Poland. And so he's going to finish up things by going into Denmark. And, of course, I'm going to have to erase this a little bit here. And fixing my map here, they're going to push to the north. Right? And the Nazis come to the north, and now they're going to hammer Denmark, the old place where Otto von Bismarck had hit. And he's going to push his soldiers through that land. Remember, just going in that counterclockwise direction. Next place that he's going to hit, because remember, he's got to clean up this area. He's going around counterclockwise. He's going to test out his infantry and his ability to use his air force by going after the Vikings in Norway, right? Of course, not still Vikings, but you get my drift. And he pushes through, and he's going to take over Norway. When the Norwegians fall, now he feels like he can really do this thing. Now he's got everyone around. He's made a total circle. He's made friends with the Italians down here, with fascist Mussolini. They're agreeing to be friends. The Japanese are going to get on board. The Italians begin conquering some of these Slavic states here. Hungary and Romania are going to fall. And, the center of the world is starting to look German. But again, you still have to take out France, right? So Germany goes to its old playbook, really. They're going to go ahead and make it look like they are mounting a force right through Belgium. You must ask yourself, why would they do that? Well, remember back in World War I, how did they do it? They went through Belgium, von Schlieffen Plan. So what he does is he fakes von Schlieffen Plan, right? He puts some of his soldiers here in Belgium, get everyone afraid. And so all of the forces of the French, well, they do what's natural. They think, oh, it's von Schlieffen Plan, and they start to move their forces right here, trying to protect the border, taking away these soldiers. Meanwhile, what the Germans do is they recognize that the French have left a territory known as the Ardennes Forest, sort of blanketed open, and they take their forces and they come back door and they hit these Allied troops from behind. They essentially cut back door using the full force of the Wehrmacht, full force of the army, and they take out the French. And then what happens, of course, is that all of France is fallen in the north, and the south is going to become a rebel government, okay? But this whole area here in the north is going to be known as Vichy France, a puppet government. And of course, the Allies have to go move north, and they go across this channel here, this famous, evacuation of Dunkirk, and they hide in Great Britain to make their assault. But this is the situation that you get in World War II. Now, what Adolf Hitler then does is he starts to bomb Britain. So he's going to start to bomb Britain, bomb London. He's going to bomb these cities left and right. Now, the British had actually done some bombing raids of their own. They bombed Berlin, and when that happened, Adolf Hitler, in his anger and fits of rage that he was very accustomed to having, just sends a full-scale invasion, and we've got, something like 76 days of bombing, 76 days of bombing, and it's just going and going and going, and the British people do not surrender because, in large part, Winston Churchill uses nationalism. He organizes the people together, and he says, we're not going to quit, we're not going to bail. We're not going to back down. Kind of similar to the FDR fireside chats of the Great Depression. It's this type of talk and rhetoric that keeps the British going. And pretty soon, Adolf Hitler can't understand it. He doesn't understand, like, why won't they fall? And then he has this brilliant idea that the reason why they won't fall is because of the Soviets out here in Russia. And so he organizes all of his military resources together, and here's what he does next. He takes everything that he has gained so far, stops bombing Britain, and turns tail and puts a full-on invasion into the Soviet Union, into the SSSR. And here we go. USSR is backing up. They are not ready for this thing. It's a full-on invasion, and we call it Operation Barbarossa. This full-on blitzkrieg, time after time after time. And they're going to meet at this place called Stalingrad. And basically what happens is the Soviets go to their old strategy. Think of what happened when Napoleon invaded. They back up, they burn. They back up, they burn. Scorched earth policy. And they meet at Stalingrad. And it's this moment where if they can capture Stalingrad, it's a symbolic victory, but it's also going to be a strategic victory because there's a lot of factories there. Think 5-year plans of Stalin. Well, Stalingrad does not fall. The Soviets hold out. There's a huge sniper battle going on, and eventually the Soviets hold on. And what will happen after this is the Soviets push forward and the Nazis are pushed back. Operation Barbarossa is a failure, in large part because of the same reasons that Napoleon couldn't conquer. Geography is real, it is strong, and the Germans are pushed back. So, this is the situation, this complicated map. This is what I need you to be able to do, which is to explain to me how we get to this full-on, Nazi aggression in a counterclockwise direction. All right, so we'll erase those lines somehow, some way, and we'll keep moving, and we'll keep going to our next slide here. So you should be able to fill this appeasement clock out, right? So you write the word appeasement up at the top. You got the Rhineland, you got Austria, you got Czechoslovakia, the whole nine. Make sure that you're able to do it. And at the Munich conference, remember what he calls the Allies. He's calling them worms. He's calling the League of Nations worms. He's really taking it to them. Here's a little survey of the damage of Winston Churchill, and again, he is just able to bring these people together in this impressive sort of way. And there's his famous quote, his famous speech that he's given. If you ever see The Darkest Hour, great film, it really encapsulates who Winston Churchill is. Here's a great political cartoon to talk about Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler and what they're about to do, which is to violate the Nazi-Soviet Pact. And it's just a matter of who is going to betray who first. And of course it is Adolf Hitler who does it, and he does it through Operation Barbarossa. Here's an interesting photograph of Adolf Hitler sitting at the tomb of Napoleon, and he'll go on to make the same mistakes that Napoleon did. So, a couple things you should be able to write down. No Operation Barbarossa. No, Germany used blitzkriegs to do it, and that the Russians fired back with the scorched earth policy. Germany loses, and they're on the defensive. For the first time in this war, I can say the Germans are on defense. So there's your Battle of Stalingrad. Now, meanwhile, what else is going on? Well, on December 7th, 1941, you get Pearl Harbor. The United States had been involved through the Lend-Lease Act. They had threatened Japan with an embargo, and when Japan heard that news, Japan decides to destroy the American fleet, or at least try to. They certainly did not, and we know that now. They did not destroy the fleet, but they thought that they could if they had tried a sneak attack. And they came close. Devastation, a nasty moment in American history where Franklin Delano Roosevelt just mobilizes the masses and says, listen, we've got to go after the Japanese, and we've got to do it on the Allies' side. So there you go, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This is like bringing us to a level where it's like, you've got to go after the Japanese. You can't let them do that. As Stalingrad's going on, you also have Adolf Hitler had given his best general, whom a man we call the Desert Fox, right? Erwin Rommel had gotten control of North Africa, and he had been fighting the Allies. The Allies decided to open up a new front and really try to hit the Axis powers from a spot where they wouldn't be thinking about. Hit them from the south, Move up through the north and try to, eventually at least, capture through Italy. They thought that was like the weak side of the Axis, and in many ways they're right. So El Alamein is a defining moment. El Alamein is a battle where the Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, he had asked Adolf Hitler for extra supplies, weaponry, etc., because he needed more men, really, but he needed more resources to fight against the Allies, who was sort of like doing it on his own, if you will. And he was very smart and talented, but it wasn't enough. And when he lost at El Alamein, instead of being like recognized as a great military leader and being sent to do other work, Adolf Hitler gave him two choices. He said, I can embarrass you and your family by putting you on a trial in which I'll find you guilty and you'll be put to death via military law and military tribunal. He says, or you could take your own life and spare your family the embarrassment of you in losing. And he took the latter. He ended up killing himself. And it just sort of goes to show you how nasty and evil these men are. Joseph Stalin did the same thing to his generals. Whenever these guys lose, they blame it on somebody else. This scapegoating that's going on. So there's Erwin Rommel and the Desert Fox. So a couple things you should know is that he is the man of the North African theater for the Nazis. And it's the British who are mainly doing a lot of the fighting here. Some Australians too, but that's kind of the battleground in North Africa. Now, because of the losses at Stalingrad, because of the losses at El Alamein, the Allies are starting to push up through Italy. Meanwhile, they're trying to get a force together, and they want to do something pretty extraordinary. They want to try their best to invade and really take it to Adolf Hitler. So here's the goal. The German army had created what's called the Atlantic Wall, a series of concrete bunkers and structures to try to insulate them from the Allies. And what the Allies did is they used a fake strategy, kind of like Adolf Hitler did. They put all of their resources in this place over here called Dover, okay? And they put fake resources, a bunch of crates and things like that, cars, all types of stuff over in Dover because it looked like this was the closest place to hit the Allies, come right through Dover. Well, what they really did is they launched the real invasion and they hit Normandy's walls and they hit this beach and they decided that they were going to take the north of France and liberate. And here's the Atlantic Wall there. They put machine guns. They had these horrible landmines that would bounce up and take you out from the knees. And Adolf Hitler wanted to scare the Allies. He said he wanted the first wave to be so destroyed and in pain and screaming that the second wave would turn tail and run. Of course, that's not what happened, but that's the military strategy behind it. Eisenhower, who would later become president of the United States, actually told some of his soldiers that they had to create a distraction. And you can imagine what that must have felt like, basically telling these boys, like, you're the decoy. I want you to land behind the Atlantic Wall, just disrupt things, blow up bridges, make it tough for the Nazis to ever come and hit us. You guys are the distractions. And he said it was one of the hardest speeches he ever gave. And this is coming from the president of the United States. Here's the beaches, as you can see here, and the scene that's shown. Here's the men coming out under chaos and fire and all these horrible things. And you really got to see Saving Private Ryan to really get a better understanding of what it looked like. And I can tell you from being on the beaches myself, it's a surreal kind of place. Here are the front-facing boats that come down, and the Nazis just destroyed our soldiers coming out, so they had to go over the sides just to avoid the machine gun fire. Absolutely brutal. They call them the greatest generation, those men that fought in World War II, and from this bravery you can sort of see why. Here are the different divisions, including Canadian divisions and British divisions. You got everybody here. So we call it a turning point. It's Operation Overlord. It's also known as D-Day, right? Know these things. June 6, 1944. This is the day where the Allies land on the beaches of Normandy. This is the time where France is going to be liberated. And the Allies do what they do. They come in and they are able to really smash the Atlantic Wall. And in some places, you have casualties of 90%. Like 9 out of 10 people either injured or killed on this invasion. It's brutal. It's nasty. But it is D-Day. I had the opportunity to go to France, and so here's a picture of the cemetery. Again, just a absolutely surreal place to be at. Here's the overlook of the beaches here. You know, people swimming in them now. It almost doesn't seem right, you know, from where you are and knowing what happened. Here's a monument to the beaches of Normandy here. So, now that we've talked about Stalingrad, El Alamein, and D-Day, and you've got like a snapshot of each, Adolf Hitler's last stand is the Battle of the Bulge. Basically, American forces hold out as this wounded animal sort of carves in at the American forces. And we hold off until we get to victory in Europe Day, also known as VE Day. It was this final push, and what happened was, because he pushed the soldier, you know, his units too far, he created this Charles Whittlesey effect where he got surrounded on all sides, and once he got surrounded, we were able to really take him out. So here's the Battle of the Bulge. We were finally able to defeat Germany, and the war is over. Adolf Hitler commits suicide in his bunker, and you get an end of the war where Mussolini's hung down, he's brutalized and eventually killed by his own people, and now we've got to finish with Japan. By the way, you should know who the big three are in this whole thing. This is the Yalta Conference, basically where FDR, Stalin, and Churchill meet, and they will decide the format for the rest of the war, which is to divide Germany up after they've effectively just dismantled the Nazi regime. They'll allow Stalin to take the East, and the rest of us get the West. Okay, they divide the world in half. They create the United Nations. The USSR is a part of it, but I wouldn't call them an active member. Many times it's the West versus the East, communism versus capitalism and democracy. It'll look something like this. And in later videos of the Cold War, we break this down just a little bit more. But here's the situation. Winston Churchill famously called this division between democracy, capitalism, and communism and authoritarianism as the Iron Curtain. Europe has been divided, and we have an end to the European theater. Not the Pacific theater, though. Right? The Japanese are still fighting on. The Japanese have developed a strategy. They call it, or we'll call it 10 to 1. Take 10 Americans down before dying if you want to be seen as honorable. And when the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, one of the things they did is they began a quick land grab. Grab as much as they could. One of the places that they went to was the Philippines, which the Americans had actually taken over and colonized after the Spanish-American War. And so they really brutalized this entire area of the Pacific. And to sort of spotlight this, in the Philippines at least, this is a good example of what they do to these, soldiers there. Lieutenant Colonel William Dias has a really interesting account. He's an American Marine that served. And he went through what is called the Bataan Death March. This is a picture of the Philippines here in the route of the Death March. In the hot sun, these guys walked through this terrible Pacific heat. And what the Japanese would do, they'd march day, they march night, is they took water and they would just like sprinkle it out, on the hot floor, as if to say like these guys they're not gonna make it. And once you're really, really thirsty, to see someone do that is torturous. Another thing they would do is they'd stop by waterfalls, and then they would wait for someone to rush out, and then they would shoot these soldiers who broke line, who broke formation. They would just stand and just make you look at the water, just to make you so thirsty that you'd want to move. He said that I was walking, and I would just see these orange flashes behind me. And he knew what they were, obviously. They were the muzzle flashes. And he said, one of the Japanese soldiers came up to him and he said, you know, in broken English, he said, "You want sleepy?" He said, "Just lie down on road. You'll get a good long sleep." Basically telling him that he'd kill him if he would just lay there. When they got to the camps, they used to, you know, really treat them like animals. You know, put them in little cages and things like that. They had them in isolated camps later on. They would use mass punishment. So if you tried to run away, they would kill your friends and your buddies indiscriminately, by the way. This was a brutal occupation, and to be captured by the Japanese was a death sentence. So the Americans are trying to develop a strategy called island hopping. Basically what we would do to counter this 10-to-1 is we would take an island, build an air base, just a temporary one, and launch to the next island. Hammer that island, send our troops over to clean it up, and move island by island by island. Basically trying to create this American rabbit, if you will. Island hop, island hop, island hop. Meanwhile, you're fighting against this 10-to-1 strategy where you get bonsai charges, where these Japanese soldiers run in, pull pins, and run into a crowd of American soldiers. I mean, just brutal kind of stuff. So the war in the Pacific comes down to a couple of things. You've got this Bataan Death March, you've got the island hopping going on, and some battles that we'll spotlight would be Iwo Jima. That'll be the one that I really go at. And it's a brutal one. We've talked about the kamikaze storms before. Remember that the kamikaze pilots are essentially Japan creates their storm of heaven, but they do it by using literal pilots, literal people, to become the storm. So there are your kamikaze pilots coming at the Americans. Iwo Jima is just an example of one of these island battles. There's so many, right? And this one is a brutal one. It's why we're going to watch the film Letters from Iwo Jima. For 35 days, we had to take this little, small island. The Japanese had dug in. They dug this series of network, elaborate tunnels, and then they made the Americans come in to take it. It took us 35 days to do so. So there it is. That's Mount Suribachi. And the Americans used flamethrowers to get in there and, you know, sort of force the Japanese out of the tunnels. That doesn't mean to say that that's easy. It was brutal. It took forever. It took very long. I mean, over a month to take this small island tells you that. This famous photograph is taken. This is the recopied version. So this is the second raising of the flag. The first one was a smaller flag, and that's the real one. These guys are essentially staging this so that it could be used for American propaganda to sell the war. We'll talk more about this in 11th grade, about who these soldiers are and what they did. It's a brutal story, one that we'll talk about later. Quick story I tell my students is about Chichi-Jima. You'll have to come to class to hear this one, though. So, I leave you with this. Japan is a dying but defiant empire. They will not break. We talk about how we use the code talkers to sort of try to make things hard on the Japanese, to make things difficult. We developed an unbreakable code using an oral language through the Navajo, right? And we're trying to break these Japanese, but they would not. We're trying to get them to give in, and yet they refuse. We start using firebombing strategies, using napalm to try to hammer these wooden, built homes over in Japan, and to no avail. They just would not quit. So eventually we come up with a formula, some crazy formula, one that you've seen before, I am sure, by Albert Einstein, a formula known as E equals mc squared. It's a dangerous formula. It's a scary formula. It says that a small amount of mass, if moved fast, like say at the speed of light squared, c squared is the speed of light squared. If you can get these molecules, these atoms moving at a fast enough speed, you can have untold quantities of energy. It has to be the right mass. I'm talking uranium, right? If you can get uranium in a perfect isotope of 235, this is the thing that could destroy and make for an entirely different sort of warfare. A bomb that we've never seen before. So to give you an idea, the war cake that you're going to make. It's 350 degrees. The sun burns at 9,000 degrees. There was a belief that they could get an explosion of 100 million degrees. It's astronomical. It's almost unfathomable. It's heat so hot that it vaporizes. Like, you're there, and then all that's left is your shadow. Nothing left, okay, but a shadow. That type of power. And Einstein knew it. So Einstein goes out and makes it purposeful and intent. He says, listen, I don't want the Nazis to figure this out. I want you to find it first. And he's saying this to FDR. He's saying it to the Americans. And so he gives them the basics of the formula. And then the Americans hire a guy by the name of Edward Oppenheimer, who takes this idea of uranium and finds the right mass, uranium-235. He's using a process called fission. Ask the science department more about it. But essentially what he's going to do is he's going to get all the men together at this place called Manhattan in New York, and he gets the guys together and says, listen, we're going to go to a place. I can't tell you where. I can't tell you too much about the details. All I can tell you is you can bring your family. You're going to live there until we finish the project. The project will win the war. And when these scientists sign up, Edward Oppenheimer chooses Los Alamos in New Mexico, a place where he used to have Boy Scouts out there, and they build an entire town. Town with movie theaters, grocery store, pharmacy department, the whole nine. The whole place is set up there. And FDR gives him an unlimited budget and says, figure it out. Well, as the war is commencing and going on, they do figure it out. Problem is FDR dies. Brain hemorrhage. Okay? We know that his health wasn't so good. He had polio. So the next president comes in. His name is Harry S. Truman. And Truman gets a call that would decide the world. He's at this place called Potsdam where they're figuring out how are these borders going to be handled and how are they going to finish this war. And he gets this call, and the call says, listen, we figured out the bomb. We want to test it. Truman says, okay, let's test it. He gets the news back. Positive. It worked. The bomb worked. This famous test in history called the Trinity test. They said some scientists quit on the spot when they heard and saw and felt the power of this atomic bomb. Said, I don't want to be a part of that, right? To be a destroyer of worlds. And Harry S. Truman sends a message to the Japanese. And by the way, this atomic bomb's, pushing 600 miles per hour, in all directions. It comes out, and then it comes back in, and then it rains down this fallout. And so he's got this bomb, he's got this powerhouse in his disposal, and he says, surrender, Japan, or face complete and utter destruction. Some historians say that was too cryptic. Other people say that's pretty, clear. I don't know where you stand, but it's certainly something to think about. So the next thing was to get the bomb to the island of Tinian. And to get it there, they hired a group called the USS Indianapolis, a group that had no idea what they were transporting. They just had this big lead box that they had to take over, and the bomb would be assembled over at Tinian. Problem is they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know whether they were carrying this thing. They didn't have an escort, none of the like. But they get over there, and it worked out. It was successful. Here's the Enola Gay, which is the plane that dropped the atomic bomb there. Here's the outfits and the jacket that was worn. And here's the devastation. Hiroshima in 1945. Just the chaos, right? There's the USS Indianapolis, the ship that took the bomb across to the island of Tinian. They were actually hit on their way back by a awful device called the Kaiten, which is basically a kamikaze underwater where these soldiers would get into these torpedoes and then they could steer them. So it's called a Kaiten. The ship captain, Mrcasey, ends up taking his own life because he was told by the U.S. Army that he could not get the U.S. Navy that he would not get an escort coming back from Tinian. He was hit by a torpedo. He did not evade well enough, obviously. He was criticized for that. They criticized him so much and put him on military tribunal. They put him in front of a military court and court-martialed this guy and said, you should have done this. This is your fault. The American people were struck because they couldn't imagine all their boys dying from this thing. And so it's this awful recipe, and McVeigh should have been a hero. Should be a guy that we're looking back in the history books as this heroic figure. He was, but he ends up taking his own life. And the movie, the USS Indianapolis, sort of tries to capture this as best they can. It's a tragic story where we should treat our heroes better. So here's the atomic bomb. It's the Manhattan Project. Know that, right? Truman is going to send the Potsdam Declaration. You should know, he says, surrender or face complete and utter destruction. When Japan refuses, he launches one bomb, August 6, 1945, on Hiroshima, the size of Schenectady, roughly. He comes back on August 9th with a second bomb, drops it on Nagasaki. And by August 15th, they surrender. Okay? Was that enough time between the 6th and the 9th? That's something that you need to decide for yourself. I know this. Once Japan signs the treaty, it's all over. Truman also has got this thing going in his head, the reasons for why he was going to drop the bomb. He estimated he'd lose 1 million men if he went in and invaded with a land invasion. That was his estimate. He heard and learned that the Japanese were arming their civilians, kids with backpacks with explosives in it, grandparents with bamboo sticks with charges on the end to destroy Sherman tanks. I mean, this whole nasty sort of full mobilization where they took the Code of Bushido, twisted it to fit their ends and said, listen, if you're going to live in this country, you're going to die for this country, and you're going to do it if it takes your own life, that's the way to get to this honorable death. It's this twist on samurai code. It's this twist on seppuku. It's really, really nasty stuff. So, Potsdam changes things. Potsdam is the place where we realize that Joseph Stalin is not in the business of being an ally, and instead we're going to have to put pressure on him. Truman wants democracy. Stalin refuses. He calls his eastern half democracy. It's really just communist dictatorships. And democracy is going to battle versus the communism of the East. And this is how we understand the Cold War, through the Iron Curtain. If you're in the East, you're communist, and if you're in the West, you're democracy, capitalism. And that's the situation that we're going to have to battle against, and we're going to have to figure out. So I leave you with a couple of things. What's the impact of World War II? Death tolls that are astronomical. I talk to my students about the Holocaust and what those type of human rights violations look like. I don't think it's a proper space to do it here. So if you have more questions, I can talk to you individually. World War II is a massive conflict. I wish I could say that we've, all of a sudden learned from all of our follies. But what I will spend in the latter part of the course is talking to you about the new style of war that we do. Some of it's ground forces, but a lot of it is not. A lot of it is what we call proxy war. So we'll take a look at the Cold War coming out of this. I hope that you got something from this lecture. I went super fast, but I know you can handle it. Good luck on your quiz, guys.